Hello and welcome to the week 8 lectures for my online philosophy of mind course, which I'm running at LaGuardia Community College. If you've been joining and following along, you might know I haven't been feeling very well for the last few days, although I am feeling better today. So hopefully that recording this lecture will be a little bit more fun for me. I've been looking forward to getting to this lecture because the mind-brain identity theory, I think, is a very important theory and very interesting. So let's go ahead and jump right in because there's a lot of stuff to cover right here. So we've been looking at the mind-body problem, and so far what we've seen is that if you want to have some kind of substance dualism, it looks like epiphenomenalism is looming. And epiphenomenalism is the view that the mind doesn't have any kind of causal interaction with the physical world whatsoever. So it's kind of just floating there. And of course, it becomes very mysterious then, like how we know about it and why it seems the case that consciousness does play a role and the mind does have some causal influence in the world. So that seems to be a big problem. And one way that people deal with this problem is to argue that the mind just is something physical. And we've seen people going all the way back to Democritus, and Democritus lives roughly around the same time as Socrates does. And he argued that the mind really was just a special kind of atom, distinguished from the other atoms by its shape. So people have been materialists, but we haven't really been looking at the role that the brain in particular plays in people's thinking about the mind. And so this week's discussion is about the idea that the simplest physicalist idea being just that the mind is the brain, that whatever they are the same thing. Now, of course, one question you might have is why we pick the brain, and that's part of a long history of this stuff. And part of what I want to do is look a little bit back at the history of this, and we'll go kind of quickly through the history. I know I have a tendency to get sidetracked by talking about all the minutia of the history, and sometimes that's not the most important thing, but I think it is important for us to have some grasp of the history of this stuff because it puts the stuff that we're interested in perspective. And so you may wonder why we do things the way that we do, and it's because we're coming out of this long history. So now I'm not going to turn this into a philosophy of biology class or a history of philosophy of biology class, but we're going to start back in the same era that we did before and we'll start with Hippocrates, who of course is really well known, and we still have the Hippocratic Oath. He gets credited with sort of being the first Western doctor. And roughly what he does is just take this idea that I call the philosophical method, the philosophical approach, and to apply it to medicine. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but basically the idea is that the world is a natural, orderly place that doesn't have any kind of supernatural stuff going on in it, and it's explainable completely in terms of the stuff that we find around here. That was what I call the difference between the pre-philosophical way of thinking and the philosophical way of thinking. And so, you know, if you're interested, you can go and watch my video, What is Philosophy, where I talk about this. But for now, we'll just point out that Hippocrates was interested in explaining diseases naturalistically, and he's credited with talking about the brain. And in particular, he's credited with speculating that the epilepsy is caused by some kind of brain disorder. And, you know, it's not really 100% clear why he thought that, to be honest. But they didn't really know much about the brain in ancient Greece because there was a taboo on human autopsy. There was a certain view about the body, which led people to do dissections on animals, but not really to do human dissections. And so in this period of time, people weren't really talking about the brain, even though you have some people speculating about it. And there are also these rumors that Plato seemed to have thought that somehow the brain was important, or what they call the seat of the soul. And of course, by the seat of the soul, that's a weird way of putting it, but we talked a little bit about the idea that Plato had this mind-body relationship in his thinking, And so he often, or Socrates often says things that the soul uses the body as a means of perception. And so that's interesting. Um, and so I don't know exactly where he says this. I've looked through the dialogues and I can't find it. If anyone out there knows where Plato talks about the brain in particular, I would like to know. Now, on the other hand, Aristotle, it's a little bit more clear because you can find where he talks about this stuff. And with Aristotle, he's pretty clear that the brain is not where the action is. Excuse me. So I am feeling better. No Advil sinuses today, but still not 100%. So sorry for any coughing, But yeah, my lungs still haven't cleared up. At any rate, though, Aristotle really thought that the heart was where the mind and the body must somehow coalesce or interact. And he seems to have thought it for kind of largely a priori reasons, roughly speaking, that the heart was in the center, and the center was the best place to be. You can get around from the center. You can, communicate with everything. And so he seemed to think that was important. And of course, that's why the title of this slide, we still say things like, I know it by heart. Because for a long time after this, there's kind of a battle. Two camps form, if you will. One camp who says that the brain is what's doing something involved with thinking, and you don't have to think it's identical. You just have to think that that's sort of where this non-physical thing would have to interact. So remember, part of the problem here is if you think there are two things, you have to say where they connect. And so some people would say, well, they connect in the heart, and other people say, oh, they connect in the brain. So you don't have to buy into an identity or some kind of claim that they're the same thing in order to be worried about this question. The general issue is one that everyone who's talking about the mind-body problem should care about. So these two camps form roughly the heart or the brain. And what we see is, here's the star of the show, and that's the human brain. So I should have warned you that this was coming up on this slide, but I figured we may as well throw it out there. And they may have had a taboo on human dissection in Athens, but we don't have that taboo, and some people donate their bodies to science, and this is the brain of one of those people. And so you can see the structure of the brain, which was starting to be known like after the Greek period of time. In antiquity, in the first 100 or so years after year one, you see people doing this dissections and noting the two sides. So you see the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere. You see the cerebellum down there at the bottom. And we'll talk a lot about that, but I thought it was important to see that because according to the view under consideration, that is the mind. That's what it is. When that thing is working, doing what it's doing mind stuff. Okay, so now the next kind of milestone here starts with Galen, and Galen is very famous, and so you can see this is sort of 200 years or so after year one, and he gives a lecture on the brain, and he's really getting into the anatomy of it here, and develops the very popular theory of the animal spirits, which lasts for a long time, and so I'm not going to dwell on this. I always say that and then end up dwelling on it anyway, but I promise not to dwell on this. But the basic idea is that it's a spirit not in the sense of a non-physical spirit, but more in the sense of an alcoholic spirit. So if you think about whiskey, something that I enjoy very much, and I wish I was having some right now instead of coffee, but at any point, if you think of whiskey, what you do to make it is you take some liquid and you cook it slowly, and it sort of evaporates and forms this mist, this vapor. And you collect that vapor and drop it down, condense it into a liquid form, and collect that liquid, and that's the product, the whiskey. So in the vapor stage, that's the spirit. It's this kind of vaporous thing. It's just kind of mist. So Galen thought that the way that the brain communicated with the rest of the body, and he did advocate this, and people also thought the heart might be involved with this because they thought, well, the ventricles of the heart, which are these nice open spaces, might be taking or distilling out some kind of vapor from the blood as it is in the heart. They weren't clear on what was going on there, but that's what Galen thought. And so he thought that the ventricles, which are in the brain, which are these little areas of filled with liquid, cerebral spinal fluid, as it turns out. Well, he thought, well, in there you would have these spirits, and it could be distilled out, and the brain would distill them out and distribute them through the body, and you would use them. And other people thought, no, the heart was doing it. And so people argued about where this was going on, but there was a general theory that the way that the body operated was according to these animal spirits. And roughly speaking, the going metaphor is one of hydraulics, and it's no mystery that this is kind of the metaphor that they're using, because hydraulics are a big part of the day-to-day life. And by the time we get to the time of Descartes, hydraulics are very much developed and in play. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So that's interesting, these ideas of these vesicles. And here's a drawing from, I think it's from Rufus of Epheseas. So that's what you get if you look his work up. And this is, again, sort of a medieval anatomist of the brain. And you see them sort of focusing. By the way, this is from a book of his called On the Names of the Parts of the Human Body. And you see that this is a dead person. The tongue is kind of sticking out. But you can see up in the head there these three ventricles. And those are the three kind of open spaces, what you find if you were to dissect a brain. You'd find these three open spaces. And so they identified those as each one of them being important. And so here's a close-up of that picture. So often it was said that imagination was in the first one, reason in the second one, memory in the third one. And sort of imagination here means the sort of taking of images, like the thing that generates experience and stuff like that. So that was the idea, and you see this popping up all over the place. So here's another drawing of some other people, corpses, from that same period of time. And you see the three ventricles, and this is a common theme from this period, that the way the body works is in this hydraulic manner. That it's roughly just fluids. Some fluids can have things distilled out of them, little vapors. Those vapors can be moved around and collected and, distilled back into liquids. So maybe that's what the heart is doing. It's, collecting liquids. And so they had this whole theory worked out. Now, I'll just mention one person here in passing because I think it's interesting. But so here's, in the West, who's known as Avicenna, and I never can say Avicenna or whatever his Western name is, but this is Ibn Sina here, and very influential philosopher of the medieval period. So you see him living here 980 to 1037, and writes a very, very, very influential book, The Canons of Medicine, and he's a very interesting philosopher, and if this were a different kind of class, we could spend like the whole period, excuse me, the whole semester just discussing this stuff. But, well, I'll just point that out. He's interested in vision. He talks about vision, also lots of other stuff. But for our purposes, one of the things that he points out is that the people of his time seem to really think Galen is interesting and special, and he likes Aristotle. So and this is sort of typical of this time period, that you see the influence of Aristotle in the East, not in the West. And so he recommends that people should that worry about this thing called the sensus communis, or the common sense, which is somehow supposed to be the place where all these various things come together and form one unified conscious experience. That's the common sense, the thing which all these little parts somehow produce. And so he wondered about that. And we're not going to turn this into a history of this stuff, but I just think it's important to mention this. And of course, when you're scooting through history in the way that we are, how could you not mention Leonardo da Vinci, who we haven't brought up yet, but of course, he's one of the great geniuses of history. And so here's some sketches. He was also an anatomist, and he was a careful student of the human body and anatomy, and he did it because he was interested in art. He wanted to really be able to draw lifelike figures. And to be honest, I don't know if he did it because he was interested in art. I'm not sure if that's true, but he seems to be generally interested in all sorts of stuff. I mean, the more you learn about this guy, the more you're amazed by him. But here are some pictures of the ventricles. So you see still this idea that the ventricles are important. This is in the 1400s, the 1500s. And so if you think back to our other discussions, Descartes hasn't even come onto the scene yet. Galileo hasn't showed up yet. This is all sort of just before that. And this is the culmination of this kind of previous way of talking about things. The hydraulic, ventricle, animal spirit kind of view is really being developed. And the drawings on the left there are kind of cool because what Da Vinci would do is like take brains and fill them with wax and then make a cast of them and then draw it. And so he gets these really nice pictures over here. And you can see, here's a picture from a modern textbook of the ventricles, and you can see that, he had it right. His drawings really do capture the shape of these things. Now, of course, they always saw them empty, so they assumed that there could be gases and liquids and stuff in there. And, there's some liquids in the brain ones and some emptiness here, and they thought they would be filling up and lowering down, and there would be this kind of hydraulic system set up there. Now, all of that is like a super quick history of everything that happens before the people that we're interested show up, like Descartes and Newton and all of these guys. And so I'll mention a couple of them here. One of the important ones is Thomas Willis, and you can see his dates there, 1621 to 1675. And I like Thomas Willis. I remember as a student learning about the Circle of Willis, and I always really wondered, why do they call it the Circle of Willis? Being a child of the 80s, I wondered, did it have anything to do with different strokes? Of course, it doesn't have anything to do with different strokes. It has to do with Thomas Willis, who discovered it. But what's interesting for our purposes is not that he's involved with the Circle of Willis, named after him, but that in 1664, he has a book on neural anatomy where he really is critical of the ventricle hydraulic Aristotelian kind of idea. He thinks it just, the animal spirits thing just doesn't work. So just as in the other areas of physics, also in biology, people are starting to rebel against Aristotle's ideas. So here's a picture of his actual book, which some of the drawings that he's doing, you're seeing, he's actually a pretty good artist. These drawings are pretty cool. So one other person from this time that we'll mention here is Steno, Nicolas Steno, also from the same period, right? This is 1638 to 1686. And the reason why I want to mention him is because he sort of is credited with definitively establishing that the heart is just a muscle. What by just a muscle, I mean a muscle like the ones you find other places in the body, like in the leg. And he does it by boiling cow hearts and then comparing the boiled tissue to other muscle tissues. It's pretty disgusting, but that's the way that he does it. And he's really interested in the cortex of the brain, and he thinks that that's something that people should pay attention to. And it turns out that he's right. So he's really trying to push against the idea that the heart is what's the biological organ of the mind, whatever you think that is. So we're focusing away from the heart at this point. And of course, by this time, Descartes would be on the scene. And if you look back at history, you see Descartes is for the idea of animal spirits. He's very much into the idea that what the heart does is distill the spirits out. So he's maybe on board with the claim that the brain is where these things connect. And so he would think the brain is where the mind connects to the physical world, and the pineal gland is important with that. But he was very much involved with the idea that animal spirits and the hydraulic model of human action was something they took seriously. And that's because by this time they had really good anatomically, interestingly functionable hydraulic figures of the kind, if you think about going to Disneyland and seeing the little animatronic figures there. Those ones are electronical or electrical, if you will, whereas these ones are hydraulic, but you get the idea. You could see these sort of human-esque figures doing human-esque movements, and it was all done with hydraulics and fluids, and so people thought this was very fancy. Now, of course, all of this is wrong. That's what's so fascinating about this, is you see this 2,000-year debate about where is it, the heart of the brain. And even in the course of this debate, both parties are assuming the incorrect view about how these things are working. So even the people who like the brain still think that it's this animal spirit hydraulic stuff. But now we're starting to see something else. Well, what else would you put instead of hydraulics? Well, there was something that had been recently discovered. And here's a picture of a guy I really like, William Gilbert. Now, there's a gentleman from history, if there ever was one. And this is rewinding a little bit. We skipped over him, so we were already up to the 1680s or so. But now we're back in the 1544s for this guy to be born. And he's the one who gives us the term electricity, which I always thought was pretty cool. And this was something that surprised me when I was a young person and found this out. But the word electricity comes from the word electricus, which he coins, and it literally just means like amber. And yes, amber, like the tree sap that you find. And of course, that's because if you rub it, you can generate static electricity. And the Greek word for amber, by the way, is electron. And that's, of course, where we get electron and all the other stuff that we say about it. And Gilbert's the first person to use the word electricus to indicate the kind of attractive force that you get. So if you rub something and then it'll take a little feather and suck it up close to it, that's the static electricity. Or I'm sure you've all done this before, where your hairs fly away and it sticks to your hand, and that's static electricity. So he called it that, the electricus, and it stuck. So what's surprising is that they have not even discovered that electricity is important for brain function yet. At this point, most people are thinking in terms of, excuse me, I apologize. Most people are thinking in terms of this hydraulic model. And of course, if you want to know when is it that we discover that the electrical nature of biological communication, it's not until the 1790s. And here's the guy who does it, Luigi Galvani. And he's the person who first recognizes that it's electricity which is being sent back and forth between the brain and the muscles. And he's not working inside the brain. He's trying to figure out, how does the brain communicate to the leg muscle in order to contract it, for instance. And, electricity is one of these interesting things. We could do a whole section of a class just on that, but static electricity had been known about for quite some time. Thales talks about it, and Thales was interested in magnets, and he says some weird things about them. But it wasn't until this period in time that anyone had any clue that there were electrical impulses in the human body. So now, instead of the old idea of animal spirits, we get the modern idea that there are nerve impulses, that there are electrical signals that being generated by the brain, being sent in various ways. And so here's an illustration from Galvani's actual paper that he presented. And I really, such a great drawing. I mean, all these old scientists were such good artists, or some of them were anyway. And it's really cool. So here's an actual depiction of his experimental setup. You see the little electrical generating device there, and what he's doing. He's got his frogs. He's cut them in half and sort of exposed the nervous system. So you thought Huxley was weird last week when we were talking about the frogs. This was what they did. This is of that period. And he's taking these little current generators and he's actually stimulating the nerve and getting a response in the frog's leg, showing that it's electrical signal. He's measuring the electrical output on the other side with a thing that comes to be called the galvanometer. So this is a huge step forward. 1791 is when this is done. And you might say that this is really the first time when that we make a significant leap forward in our theorizing about the brain. 1791, even though the very first recorded mention of the brain, I think, goes back to ancient Egypt when there's some scroll, someone who got brain injury. So long time, big discovery right here. And of course, Galvani is important. He still hangs around in the words we use. We talk about being galvanized. A group of people was galvanized into action, we might say. Of course, that word comes from him. It means to be charged up. We talk about galvanic skin response. We have galvanometers. So he gets his just recognition because this is one of the monumental major discoveries of the universe, that this electricity, the stuff that's out there, somehow being generated inside. And, you know, you might find that surprising, that electricity, which was only recently really sort of known about in the same period, and Maxwell's equations are coming, that deals with electricity. And so people are really shocked by this. How did that get in there? And it shouldn't be too much of a mystery that one of the fundamental features of the world is also involved in the way that we work. I mean, people were already thinking hydraulics, thermodynamics, and heat had important things to do with life. So why not electricity? And of course, this idea that of energy and electricity that really, in the popular culture, this catches fire. And I think the best example of this is, you know, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where how did they get the thing to come to life? They lightning bolt it. So this idea that electricity, like lightning, and then also, oh, electricity in here, like brain. So maybe they're importantly related to each other. This generated some puzzles, by the way, when they started, for instance. I could tell you, I mean, again, we don't want to do too many details, but there's a whole story about von Helmholtz and calculating the speed of the action potential, and it's not the same as electrons moving in a wire, and so people have to deal with that. And there's a whole, you know, working out of this stuff. And it's really, if you think about it, 1791, 1891, 1991, has only been just over 200 years that we've discovered this about the brain. Then, okay, so some other landmarks just for reference. Single cell recordings, they take out these neurons, they learn how to voltage clamp them, keep the membrane voltage at a certain potential, and then they can record from it and they can do things to it and see how it responds. And these are single cell recordings outside of living, you know, in a dish or whatever. So that's very interesting. And then, of course, 1875, the first recording from an exposed brain. You cut open the brain, the head, and you put an electrode in there. Of course, they did that to an animal. Then, of course, there is the first EEG. You put a sensor on the scalp so you don't have to cut them open, and you record the electric signal from there. And of course, this is 1912, and it's done on a dog, and it's not done on a human till sometime later. So this is the beginning of our really beginning to be serious about the brain. All right, so we're almost done with this, but we can't leave this section with talking about two of the giants of this area, and that's Golgi and Cajal. And so on the left over here is Golgi, on the right is Ramon y Cajal. You can see their dates there, and these guys won the Nobel Prize. They shared the Nobel Prize. So Golgi developed a method for staining neurons and getting some kind of stain inside of them so you could see them really clearly in a microscope. And Ramon y Cajal, a great artist, a brilliant anatomist, in the long tradition of people drawing this stuff, he actually went then and stained these things, perfected the technique a bit, and then drew what he saw. And he drew tons of these. So here's one of his very cool drawings, this is a slice of brain where some of the neurons have been stained. And this is only some of them. And you can see the dark blobs are the kind of cell bodies. They can see that there are these cells in there. So what we saw, that bloody mass at the beginning, if you cut that into really thin slices and look inside, you find this. And of course, that's amazing. People had not realized that there were these tiny little cells in there. And of course, just so we can see a couple more, here's another drawing. This is from the 1890s. And this is supposed to be like a 3D. You can't really see it in this, but every little dot there is like it's supposed to be an axon projecting out. You see all the varieties of different cell shapes and their connections. And then just because, you know, they're so cool, I'll just show you two more. So here on the left, that's a pyramidal cell. It looks really cool, simple, elegant cell body in the middle, axons extended out. But then look at the one on the right. This is a different kind of cell. I'm guessing it's a basket cell, although I don't really know, to be honest. But you see there the axon extending down at the bottom, and then this large dendritic field. So this is an amazing thing. They find all these cells in there. And so what are you going to call those things? Well, here's a guy who knows something about names. Heinrich Wilhelm Gottfried von Waldeyer-Hartz. That's a name if ever there was one. To me, he looks a little bit like Dan Dennett. But he's the one who comes up with the term neurons. And he's probably, inspired by the people calling things electrons. And I think the electron was recently discovered, protons coming later. So, they like the word on. It makes it sound fancy. So now we have the neuron. A neuron is a special kind of cell which somehow generates electrical impulses, which then are transmitted to other cells in the brain, but also down to the muscles. So now we're starting to get some handle on what's going on here. And things kind of tool along in this way until all of a sudden, uh-oh, this guy shows up, Otto. And what he discovers changes everything because he discovers neurotransmitters. And specifically, he discovers what turns out to be acetylcholine, in case anyone cares. But what's interesting about this is, so everyone knew that, these electrical signals went down the axon, and then there was this gap, and then the next neuron was there. But in between the gap, they weren't sure. Like, what happened? Did the electricity jump like a fire jumps a fence? Or was it a kind of chemical thing going on? So what exactly, somehow they were communicating, sending a signal, because if you make one fire and it's somehow connected to that one, that other one over there will fire. So he discovers that it's a chemical reaction. Acetylcholine does it. And then it turns out there's a whole suite of these neurotransmitters. And this really complicates the entire game because now not only do we find out that the brain is an electrical organ that's generating electricity and doing something with it, but also it's a chemical organ. And that means that chemistry is relevant. And of course, chemistry is just being developed right now as well. And before you go, oh no, and groan, I will spare you the history of the transition from alchemy to what's called chemistry to what we now know as chemistry, which really is a sub-branch of the standard model of particle physics, if you get down to it. So that's a whole different story, and I'm not going to go through that history because we haven't even got to the point where we're talking about the identity theory yet. We're just trying to figure out, like, what would the identity theory even be saying? So if you want to say the mind is the brain, that's great, but let's know a little bit about the brain first. So we have our neurons now. This is what they look like in the artist rendition in the year 2013. So we've come a long way from those little black blobs with their long stretching arms. And so here what you see is a cutaway of the nucleus of a sort of typical neuron. The axon extends out. There's a synapse there. You see the dendrites here, and there's all kinds of stuff going on inside there. And I won't really go into a lot of detail about the way that this works, but roughly speaking, what we can say is that these neurons are sitting in a kind of chemical bath full of ions, which are chemicals, nutrients, which carry a charge, and it uses those to generate an action potential, which then can travel down the axon there. And I'll tell you just a tiny bit more about that in a second, but for right now, we can see once the action potential comes, you can see that red arrow coming from the top there. That's the electrical impulse that was generated in the cell body of the neuron. Once it gets there, it can release some chemicals, these neurotransmitters. There's a gap there, that's called the synaptic cleft. These things are called vesicles. I mean, we're not going to have an anatomy test, but it's important to understand some of the basics here. Now, on the other side over there are the ion channels, and those are the things in blue right there. And so when these molecules are released, neurotransmitters, they float around in the liquid, and some of them bind to the ion channels, and then those open and other things flow in and flow out and so forth and so on. And if enough of that happens in the right way, then that neuron will send an action potential down. And if it doesn't, it won't. And so that's kind of what we've discovered about the way that these things work. Now, how does it generate these electrical impulses? Well, here, if you take a neuron and you blow it up, and you look at just the cell lining, and on the top is the outside of the cell, and on the bottom is the inside of the cell. So that's called extracellular fluid. On the inside, it's called cytoplasm. Look, none of these details ultimately really matter. In between them is a layer. It's actually a bilayer made of lipid protein. So all of these things, again, not exactly that exciting. But you see these little things right here in the orange brackets. Those are the ion channels, and they can be closed or they can be open. And you see these little sodium, that's Na, and you see calcium, that's Ca, and you see potassium, that's K. And those things are floating around out there. And if the neurotransmitters that these gates like bind to them, they'll open and let some of these things in. Now, some of the calcium can't go through because, some might be blocking it, like a magnesium ion or something like that, or it's not big enough, it won't fit. So there are various things that go on. But what happens is if you take a lot of positively charged ions and they go rushing into the cell interior, then suddenly you start to generate a positive charge. Like there's a change. You get more of these positively charged things in there. And if this happens in the right way, you'll send an action potential. So why are we talking about this? Because we're trying to give a theory about how the brain works. And this is what we've discovered about it. That these neurons really are these kind of little, described in these kinds of terms right here. There's ion channels, they open, they shut. There are neurotransmitters, they control the opening and shutting. There's a bunch of other stuff that happens inside. These ions are important for transmitting the pulse. Now, we have a fairly serious understanding of what's going on. And I just want to wave my hands in one general area, which is kind of a crown jewel in early neuroscience, and that's the Hodgkin-Huxley model of the way that this happens. Because as you've seen, what people like to do is try to give a mathematical description of what's going on. And these guys won the Nobel Prize for this, basically for showing that you could model a neuron just like you model an electric circuit. So here is supposed to be an actual circuit diagram of some neuron. So the C over there is the capacitance, and then there's the resistance there located by G, and the I is current. And if you know about Ohm's law and a little bit of electronics, that's great. And if you don't, then that's fine. But roughly, you can see that you have power sources in here. Those are the neurons. They generate power by sending a action potential, and the little lines there with the E's, that represents a power source. And then there's a resistor, something which sort of resisted. That's the axon, which by the way has a myelin sheath around it, which somehow slows and dissipates some of it. And then so you get some current that flows around, and then you have a capacitor. And you can just give equations which describe this stuff, and so you can start to understand what the brain is doing in mathematical terms. And this culminates in a set of equations which describe the behavior in very limited cases. Granted, this isn't like a generalized thing yet, but this is supposed to be the beginning of something that's interesting. And we're not going to go through these equations at all. I mean, they look like gobbledygook. They're not elegant, like the ultimate equations that you get from physics. But a couple of things that you should notice about them is that, first of all, they're differential equations. So you got the dv over dt right there. And what that tells you is that they're talking about things changing in time. And in particular, they're talking about the way that the cell's voltage changes in relation to resistance and capacitance. And so you can see that this takes into account the G there, which is the same from that diagram that we just saw, for calcium, for potassium. And you can just then calculate, well, just see if the sodium levels are this high and this happens, what will be the voltage, da-da-da. Will the neuron fire, da-da-da-da-da. You can do a lot of stuff with these equations. And so that's the goal of the mind-brain identity theorist, is ultimately to give some kind of account of how the brain does what it does, and then to postulate that they are the same thing. So that ultimately the identity theory is simply the claim that every occurring mental state is identical to some occurring brain state. And we've just seen the kinds of things that count as brain states. They're electrical states, they're chemical states. Now you say, really? Is that even plausible that all the states of the mind are like that? Well, how many neurons are in the brain? We don't know. But people estimate that there are like 100 billion. Some people say more, some people say less. 100 billion different neurons. Now, of course, those things have both electrical and chemical aspects to them. And you've seen how much detail there is in even trying to wave your hands in the direction of saying something informative about what's going on there. Trillions of possible connections. So is it really that outlandish that, you know, after 200 years of sort of poking at the brain in this unsophisticated way, is it really that outlandish that we will ultimately just find out that's all there is to the mind, to intentionality, to consciousness? How do you get intentionality? Well, you know, maybe neurons represent things in the world by being caused to fire, by them being present. Maybe causal relations are important. Now, some people have tried to give concrete examples of this, and I want to just briefly look at one kind of triumphant moment in science, and this comes from the work of Eric Kandel. He's also a Nobel Prize winner. He's currently still alive, possibly one of the few people we talked about who's still hanging about. And he's at Columbia, and he's on the radio and TV all the time talking about the brain. He's done a lot of work on this stuff. And what he's really known for is working on how memories get formed and stored, and in particular in a giant sea slug. And they're these giant, disgusting sea slugs, but they're really good for neuroscientists to work with because they have big neurons, giant neurons. And so what he is credited with and what he likes to argue, and if you go and look in an introductory cognitive science book, or you go and watch a PBS special on this stuff, what they'll tell you is that memories really just are formed by electrical activations in the brain, changing the chemical structure, molecular structure of the synapses. This is something called long-term potentiation. And so, again, I'm not going to dwell on this because we're not doing a philosophy of neuroscience class here, but just to give you the flavor, because this is supposed to be the idea behind the identity theory. So you take an animal, it learns something, and like, for instance, the slug, you shock it, and it has a certain response, and if you do it enough, it learns to associate some other novel stimuli with the shock. So there's all this conditioning stuff. That's learning. So, okay, there's a kind of memory there, because if you do it again, it will remember. So how do you explain that? Well, here's our neuron. So somehow it's sending a signal. There's chemicals being released there. So what does this have to do with learning? Well, here's the simplest way to put it. If you send one signal down and you drop out 6 little transmitters, that's nice. But if you send 15 signals in rapid succession, beep, 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 and you end up dropping 400 little neural transmitters, well, then you're going to get a much bigger effect. Now, it turns out that if you do this enough, you can get a big enough effect where some secondary things happen. And this is where the interesting and exciting stuff really kicks in. So the secondary things include other kinds of, like the calciums come in and so forth, that's secondary processes. But the net result of that is that these little blue things that you see, the ion channels, well, first of all, more of them get made. More of them get made. So there's more there than was there before. And then not only that, but this is just one sort of connection between the dendrite and the axon. They get more dendrites. So not only that, not only do you get more connections, but in the connections you get more channels. And of course, the more signals that are sent, the more of this happens. And so they're demonstrating this in a sea slug. But the idea is supposed to be, look, maybe that's the same thing as what happens when you learn how to play an instrument. You move your fingers enough over and over again. So what does it mean to say that you remember how to play the guitar or to ride a bicycle? Well, they would say it means this, that there's a certain pattern in the brain, the result of long-term potentiation. And physiologically, what that means is if you send the same signal, like 4 volts or whatever, and if you do it the first time and you get like a weak signal, 1 volt on the other side, but if you do 4 volt like over and over, da 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 da, eventually, just doing it once, you get a huge signal from the other side. So it becomes much more sensitive. And this is a way of the brain sort of adjusting. It's constantly doing this. It's not a static thing. It's constantly forming new channels, new connections, spreading out. And so that then is the identity thesis. Science has shown us that water is H2O. We start with some common sense thing. We identify by pointing at water. We say a bunch of weird stuff about it. It's a simple substance. It's a basic element of reality. We chop it up. We burn it. We evaporate it. We discover it's H2O. People will point to genes and DNA, and I won't get bogged down on that because I want to get to the other stuff here. But one thing that people talk about a lot is lightning and electrical discharge. And electricity has been a theme here, so I want to focus on that. And we'll see some other people will talk about briefly focus on this as well. So lightning being electrical discharge, we have 2 different things here. One is lightning. They knew about it since the old days. The ancient Greeks talk about lightning. It's not a new discovery. But the whole concept of electrical discharge is a new discovery. We've just sort of seen how it doesn't even come around to the 1500s, the very idea of electrical discharge being something that could be what that is over there. I mean, Thales knew about static electricity. And if you said, hey, Thales, that's the same as lightning, he might have thought, yeah, if you mean it's water, because I think everything is water. That's a little Thales joke. But of course, the mind-brain identity theorist then, again, to sort of bring this home, makes the following kinds of claim. Look, just like these other things, so too, now we know long-term memory ultimately could turn out to be something like just long-term potentiation in the brain. Seeing an object in front of you may simply be having the neurons which represent are activated in response to that thing all sort of firing around in the same pattern at the same time. That's the claim the identity theorist makes. Those things really just are brain states. And we want to give some meat to that. We don't want to just say, oh, they're brain states. What does that mean? Oh, some state of the brain? So now that's why we went through this. What we mean is some electrical or chemical state of the brain. Now, of course, just as the history lesson should have taught us, we could find out next week that this whole theory of electrical chemical stuff is wrong. I mean, the hydraulic animal spirit stuff lasted for a long time. When Galen says it in 177 AD, or excuse me, CE, and then it gets, sort of refuted in 1791. Well, gee, that's, 1700 years plus. That's a long time, 1,000 years. So, this electrical stuff has only been around for a couple hundred years, and, maybe 500 years from now, we'll find out that, oh, we were so misguided. Electricity in the brain, who would have thunk it? Now, of course, we don't really believe that. We think, maybe we'll learn more about what it does, but certainly it's possible that we're wrong, and we should bear that in mind. Now, that brings us to the next point, which is, what do we say about Descartes? And so these early identity theorists who are really getting excited about this in the 50s, and you can see why, because the Hodgkin-Huxley equations are being generated in the 50s. And people are saying, oh, it's only a matter of time before brain science gets sort of shown to be like chemistry and then shown to be like physics, something that we could like fully understand in physical terms. So there's all this enthusiasm. Oh, the brain, fantastic, hello, the brain. And then you get the naysayers. Oh, well, what about, I can imagine myself without my body, Descartes' arguments for dualism. And the identity theorists of this time responded that these identity claims, the ones that scientists make, are importantly contingent. Excuse me, sorry, I'm feeling a sneeze coming on. That these identity claims are importantly contingent, and contingent is just a fancy way of saying that these identity relations are not necessary, that they could be different. They could have been different. And that's an interesting idea, one that we're going to come back to later. But for right now, we can just commonsensically point out that, many people find the idea that you can answer a question like, is the mind the brain, simply by thinking about, can you imagine something? Many people will find that to be just kind of ludicrous. How could you answer a question that is that important? Is the mind the brain? How could you answer that question without doing any science? And so many people who are responding at this time are saying to Descartes and his sort of a prioristic approach to doing these things, well, look, you can imagine anything that you like. For instance, we can imagine that water is a simple substance that isn't made of any parts. That's what Aristotle thought. We can imagine that. We can imagine that lightning is not electricity. We can imagine that it's something else, that it's heat. That's good for us and our imagination, but the question is, what is that stuff that over there that's flashing in the sky? And if that stuff that's flashing in the sky actually turns out to be electricity, then oh well for your imagination. Imagination doesn't really help us here. Science is what tells us which things are in the world. Science is what tells us whether water is H2O, whether electricity is lightning, and all of that stuff. Now, that's a very interesting kind of claim that's being made here, that you can't answer these kinds of questions on an a priori basis, but that they should be treated like ordinary scientific claims, and that they should be answered in the ways that ordinary scientific claims get answered. But is that right? So I want to finish up this discussion by looking at some quotes. And so we'll start by looking at a quote from UT Place, who's one of the sort of originators of the contemporary version of the mind-brain identity theory. And he writes a seminal paper in the 50s. It's called Is Consciousness a Brain Process? And we're reading it in class. But there's one passage I want to focus on because he sort of gets to the heart of what troubles a lot of people. So he says, I'm sort of picking up here in the middle of this discussion. He says, quote, lightning is a motion of electrons. That's something that we think science has shown us to be true. As to the case of consciousness, however, closely, we scrutinize the lightning. Excuse me, I'm messing this up. It's hard to read the computer screen because, anyway, I need Visine. Okay, so he says, as in the case of consciousness, however closely we scrutinize the lightning, we shall never be able to observe the electrical charge. What is it, therefore, that leads us to say that we have two sets of observations are really observations of the same thing? So this is the important question, because a lot of people will respond, gee, well, with water H2O, we have two things we can sort of we can identify them because there's a scientific way of showing it. But how do you do it when you can't see consciousness? Like, how do you know? You can't look in the brain and find it. You can't point at it. And I think Place's insight here is an interesting insight, and we might wonder about it, and I might want to ask you, what do you think about it? His insight is, look, the same thing is true with electricity. You can't see the electron. The electron is a theoretical posit. In the philosophy of physics class, I actually show the video of the cloud chamber. And if you haven't seen that, you should go look at it. But you can Google it. So there's tons of this kind of stuff on YouTube. But basically, the idea is that you ionize some gas vapor, some water vapor, and then you shoot some electricity through it, and you see this little poof. And then people say, aha, see, that was an electron moving through that vapor. It's negatively charged, that's positively charged, so what you saw was it zooming through, moving the other stuff out of the way. Now, that's as close as we've ever got to seeing an electron. You can't see it. But yet, we feel comfortable saying it exists and that it's identical with that thing over there, which we can see. So Place's point is, well, consciousness seems sort of to be on a par with that. You can't look in the brain and find it, but you also can't look in the lightning and find the electron. So then maybe we should think about what generally leads us to identify two sets of differing things. It's a general philosophy of science question, and Place's idea is we should apply the same strategy there. Now, this model is one that is being currently defended by Ned Block, who we've talked about in previous weeks of this class. And he's currently still alive and teaching at NYU. Now, Block is an identity theorist, at least when it comes to things like consciousness, and especially phenomenal consciousness, subjective character, and phenomenal character. So here's what he says. Here's the way scientific identities in general proceed. By the way, this quote here is from a paper that's so new it hasn't been published yet, but it's coming out in a book which will come out some year, but you could get it on his website. And I would tell you the name of the paper, but since it's been on his website, it's changed names several times. But the view that he's defending has not changed. So here's what he says. Okay, quote, if we want to know why water equals H2O, why freezing equals molecular lattice formation, why heat equals molecular kinetic energy, temperature equals mean molecular kinetic energy, etc., we have to start with the fact that water, temperature, heat, freezing, and other magnitudes form a family of causally interrelated macroscopic properties, properties of the big world. This macro family is mirrored by a family of micro properties. H2O, mean molecular kinetic energy, and formulation of a lattice of H2O molecules. Those are the micro properties which are mirrored by those properties. And of course, he wants to be sure we're aware that what's micro and macro is sort of a flexible kind of scale. But we start off saying, just like Place was saying a second ago, we have these two sets of properties. Properties from our ordinary experience, and then properties from the scientific discovery of what's out there. And we want to know in general, when do we say that these are really observations of the same thing? So here's what he says, and I think that this is the best kind of account that you can give from this perspective. So he says, the key fact is that the causal and explanatory relations among the macro properties can be explained if we suppose that the following relations hold between the families. Here are the relations. That water equals H2O, that is the same thing. That temperature equals mean molecular kinetic energy, that those are the same thing. That heat equals molecular kinetic energy, and freezing equals the lattice formation. So you can explain this stuff if you identify the properties. For example, what kind of explanations? Well, these kind. Why does decreasing the temperature of water cause it to freeze? And then also one of the other mysteries, why does ice float on water when most other things, when frozen, become more dense and then their liquid form and therefore don't float? But water behaves differently. Well, Block says, look, we can give an explanation of that. Here's the gist of the explanation. The oxygen atom in the H2O molecules has two pairs of unmated electrons which attract the hydrogen atoms on other H2O molecules. When the kinetic energy of those molecules decreases, and basically that means the temperature is decreasing, each oxygen atom tends to attract two hydrogen atoms on those ends. Normally they're moving by too fast to do anything like that. And Frankie doesn't like it when things move fast. Do you, Frankie? No, she says, slow down, you things. So now when this process is slowing down, and as they're losing this energy, the result is a lattice, which is some kind of ladder-like structure in which each oxygen atom is attached to 4 hydrogen atoms. Ice just is that lattice. And freezing is the formation of such a lattice, which is why decreasing temperature causes water to freeze. Now see, we've just given the explanation. Because of the geometry of the bonds, the lattice has an open, less dense structure. So basically, if you think about a cube where the edges form the lattice, and so it's sort of hollowed out in the middle, it has an open, less dense structure than other kinds of H2O structures like liquid water, which is why it floats, because it gets less dense as these things sort of form this lattice structure. So the idea then is, look, why do we say there aren't two things here? And this is what he says. Suppose that someone were to deny this explanation. Suppose you say, no, no, no. Water is not identical with H2O. Suppose you reject that freezing is identical to that lattice formation right there. And suppose you say, no, no, no. You just have these two things that are correlated with each other. One, the formation of the lattice, and the other, the ice, but they're not the same thing. Well, then he says, we would have an explanation for something, and that's an explanation of how these two weird correlated things are related to each other, right? An explanation for how something that is correlated with decreasing temperature causes something that's correlated with frozen water to float on something correlated with liquid water. But that's not at all what we want. Therefore, the reason to think that the identities are true is that assuming them gives us explanations that we would not otherwise have, and does not deprive us of explanations that we already do have, or raise explanatory puzzles that would not otherwise arise. So roughly speaking then, you have all these properties, you identify the ones that allow you to explain the most stuff without causing the most problems, the best fit explanatorily wise. That's the strategy. The claim that Block is making is, if you want to take a scientific approach to the to the mind-body problem, well, then what you do is you try to figure out the way identities work in science, and that's sort of the idea that Place and those guys had. And it turns out that identities are just sort of postulated, according to Block, in order to make this stuff work. So therefore, he says, we should identify mind and brain. Because just like in those other cases, we have two sets of properties. One of the properties are the phenomenal properties associated with the subjective character of experience. So those include the phenomenal property of the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, and also the subjective character that it's for me, not just for anyone. So those are properties. And on the other hand, we have properties in the brain, all of these neurobiological properties. And it seems like they correlate fairly well. For instance, one kind of nice correlation here is, if you have a certain area of the brain that seems to be involved with pain stuff, and if it's firing a lot, you have a lot of pain. And if it's not firing very much at all, you don't feel very much pain in the normal cases. That's a correlation between the activity you see in the brain and the conscious experience. So you could reject the identity and become a dualist and then say, well, those are just two separate things which are correlated with each other. But then you don't get an explanation. By identifying them, we get an explanation that we didn't have before. What is that explanation? Well, it's the one that we wanted to begin with. That conscious experiences of pain play some kind of causal role in producing my behavior. We get to say why epiphenomenalism is wrong. We don't have two properties correlated with each other, and then we're stuck with the mystery. How does the painfulness of pain do anything? Block's strategy, which is the traditional identity theory strategy coming out of the work of people like Jack Smart and U.T. Place, who, we'll talk about in class more as we read the Smart article for some classic objections. Excuse me. But this is the classic strategy. Scientific identities work like this. Therefore, the mind-brain identity should work like that. You get an explanation you wouldn't have got otherwise. Epiphenomenalism should be rejected. Consciousness is a brain state. We don't know which ones yet. We're working on that. Whichever ones they seem to be ideally correlated with, we'll identify them at a later stage. Kind of like the way we did with memory and long-term potentiation. Maybe like we're doing with synchrony and intentionality. So these are prospects for future work. But I think that's the best case for the identity theory that we have. That this is just the way science works. We postulate these kinds of identities. Now, of course, next week, we're going to look at the reaction to this view, which comes from thinking about functions and in particular computer science and the way that artificial intelligence tries to build what we've got already. So there's a whole story about functionalism coming up next week. And then, of course, we'll be talking about a lot about computation and computer science. And then after that, we'll talk about the people who think that this whole project of trying to fit the mind into the physical world as we understand it now is misguided. So still lots of interesting stuff coming up.